Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. We are going to talk today about Noam Chomsky's book, At War with Asia. We're completing the book, the last two chapters, which are North Vietnam, chapter 5, and On War Crimes, chapter 6. So it is, a good amount of material. We don't want to, get lost and, spend too much time. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. But, the basic idea of this book is the American government, murderous, angry, white mafia gangsters, the anti-Asian mafia gangsters, the gun violent gangsters of the U.S. Congress and their presidents, what they did to the Asian people in Southeast Asia. It is a remarkable thing. It is a remarkable thing to read about the crimes that the United States government committed, the U.S. Congress, the mafia, white American, murderous, gun violent gangsters that are anti-Asian in their stance, did all sorts of radical and angry things, murderous things against the people of Indochina. They committed war crime after war crime, white phosphorus, vomiting gases, just murder, machine gunning peasants, machine gunning, saturation bombing, B-52 bombing. All of these things were done by the murderous white American mafia gangsters, the white American mafia, anti-Asian, U.S. Congress gangsters. And that's what happened. And that was what happened. That was the story of that, the story of that war. And that war was, a brutal one for the Indochinese people. And in general, the Asians are mistreated by the U.S. government, white American mafia gangsters. That is what they do. They mistreat Asian Americans all across the board. And this war is a, exact example of it. They murdered peasants. They set up a white right-wing military dictatorship in all these places. They, machine gun peasants. They enslaved the people of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And they did all sorts of criminal acts of torture and, abuse and, rape, prostitution, cheating, gambling, just ruined the economy, did nothing good. It was an abysmal failure. The U.S. government's abysmal failure in Indochina. All three countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So we are going to have this book. This is the book. You please go on my website. Go on the YouTube description section and download the video. It will be available on the YouTube description section. I've provided the Google link for it. I recommend strongly you read the book because it is, an excellent example of U.S. government white mafia action. Their gun violent white mafia government action against the people of Indochina and Asia. Against the Crime of Silence is the second book. This goes through specific things on the, vomiting gases, the white phosphorus, all of the crimes against humanity. It's called the Russel Tribunal, and it's the proceedings of the International War Crimes Tribunal. I think it's an excellent book to understand war crimes that were committed and what was actually occurring. So I'm going to give you some background. Both those books will be in the description section of the video. So please go there and download them because I recommend you read the book. I do make some small changes in prose. So getting started, racist American government, murderous white gangsters involvement in North Vietnam. As we discussed, chapter 4, North Vietnam at war with Asia. The American throat-slitting Congress of white racist mafia, quote-unquote politicians, conducted a vicious campaign in Indochina against the native Asian peoples. The summary is best put forth by Phoumi Vonvichit, pathet Lao leadership, who spoke with great bitterness about the effects of the American involvement on life in Vientiane in Laos. Mr. Vongvichit, referring to the depraved American culture, which included widespread prostitution, gambling, opium and drugs, and cheating for the Laotian indigenous people, while the whites were given houses, economic success, jobs, and swimming pools. As usual, the American racist congressional mafia, gun violent gangsters, furthered fascist colonial oppression rather than democracy, as was being put forth by the pathet Lao. They flood Laos with counterpart aid policy, with surplus goods and introduction of the American depraved culture to turn Vientiane controlled areas into a U.S. military fascist new type colony. This is typical of the sadistic third world murder, rape, and torture capital of the world, Washington of the United States, which at the expense of the native third world peoples uses machine gun dictatorship, fascist violence to ensure American capitalist success while peddling lies in the media and Western press about its good intentions in liberating the people. Similar to Hitler's good intentions in liberating Europe from the Jews, the American Congress, Johnson and Nixon, had good intentions in liberating the Indochinese through murder, torture, enslavement, drugs, opium, cheating and gambling, and machine gun violence against the people. Turning to North Vietnam, we see a nation that is intent on helping its people through social upliftment, democratic scholarship and reading, book and university promotion, oil nationalization, rubber and textile nationalization, and farming of rice and other agribusiness. This contrasts sharply with the military fascist dictatorship of South Vietnam, run by the U.S. gun-violent white mafia of U.S. Congress, who promoted prostitution, opium and drugs, gambling, cheating, murder, torture, enslavement, arbitrary imprisonment, university and library destruction, and destruction of democracy for the people of South Vietnam. So the United States racist mafia of Congress compares the two societies and peddles lies in the New York Times and Washington Post about liberating, quote unquote, the Vietnamese from the communists. Similar to Hitler liberating the Polish from the Jews, the U.S. was liberating the Vietnamese through murder, torture, enslavement, prostitution, drugs and opium, napalm, white phosphorus, and other vomiting gases, as well as direct bombing. This is Washington's contribution to Indochinese history, an abysmal failure of mafia American white frauds and anti-Asian throat-slitting gangsters. The U.S. Congress, with its presidents, committed a genocide in Indochina. Again, they failed to pay reparations, to apologize for the mass murder and enslavement, destruction of the economy, and gang rape of the third world lands for capitalist oil exploitation. So it resembles the fascist American white throat-slitting and gun-violent mafia anti-Asian gangsters of the U.S. Congress and its presidents all over Asia, including China, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Japan, and Singapore. So let's get started. We have quite a bit of material to do, so I hope, we will get through all of it, but I want to get started. The International Control Commission flight to Hanoi spirals upward around Vientiane until it reaches its assigned altitude and then passes through a protected corridor over an area that has received some of the most intensive bombing in human history. A phantom jet streaked close by us, much to the annoyance of the crew and regular passengers. But apart from that, we saw nothing in the heavy clouds until the lights of Hanoi appeared below. The passengers on the flight were a curious melange, Chinese diplomats, Russian journalists, an Italian novelist, several Poles, and 3 American visitors. We arrived on April 10th and departed on the same flight a week earlier. My visit to Vietnam was brief, and my impressions are necessarily superficial. Since I do not speak Vietnamese, an interpreter was generally necessary, and although the translators were highly skilled, the process is time-consuming and certainly retards communication. I will describe what I saw and what I was told. The reader should bear in mind the limitations of what I am able to report. For a country at war, North Vietnam seems remarkably relaxed and serene. We took long walks, unaccompanied, in Hanoi and in the countryside. Occasionally, we were asked not to take pictures, for example, at the entrance to a cave in which a factory shop was hidden. Our Vietnamese host did not ask or to develop or check any of the pictures that we took, including color photos. There was also very little security so far as I could see. We visited Premier Phan Van Dong in a retreat outside the city, but noticed no guards or police anywhere near the residence. In the city, there were many soldiers sitting by the lakes, walking through the streets, or in the dense waves of cyclists. Their appearance was that of soldiers on leave. There are also many young men in both city and country in civilian occupations. I noticed only a few police, mostly directing traffic and apparently unarmed. In the countryside, A crowd of children collected around us as we walked through a remote village, some distance from the administration buildings of Than Ho province, where we spent the night. They answered we were Russians, as did the children who waved and shouted Soviet Union, quote unquote, as we drove through towns and villages. We were invariably greeted with friendly smiles, and in the more remote areas with some show of curiosity. Everywhere we went, people seemed healthy, well-fed, and adequately clothed. There was no obvious difference between living standards in city and country. Consumer goods are scarce, except for a bicycle, a thermos bottle, perhaps a radio. Most people probably have very few consumer goods. I don't think I saw more than a few dozen cars in Hanoi. The center of the city looks not very different from the outskirts. The city is clean and quiet, except for the honking of truck horns, warning bicycles to clear the way. I had heard that there were loudspeakers everywhere, blaring news and announcements, but I recall only one playing music in a downtown park. The appearance of the city is drab. The scarce resources of the country are largely diverted to the countryside. Someday, if the war ends, Hanoi will be a beautiful city with its wide tree-lined streets and many lakes and parks. The most striking difference between Hanoi and the countryside is, of course, the devastation and ruin caused by the, quote, air war of destruction. Hanoi itself, so far as I could see, was not badly hit, except near the Red River, where the bridge and surrounding areas must have been heavily bombed. But as soon as one leaves the city limits, the destruction is enormous. We traveled along the main highway to Than Ho, about 90 miles to the south. The effects of the bombing are visible everywhere. From the road, one can see the entrances to caves where the population, particularly children, were dispersed during the bombing. Temporary wooden dwellings cluster at the base of the conical hills. The craters become more dense when the bridge lies ahead. Sometimes the bridge proves to be barely a few yards long. Where there was a bridge, there was often a village. The road and the nearby rail line were also heavily bombed, and the railroad stations remain a mass of debris. Of course, the stations are invariably situated in town or village centers. Some of the names along the road were familiar to me from reading. For example, Phu Lai, about 10 miles south of Hanoi, which was visited by French and Japanese newsmen shortly after a particularly savage bombing raid. I asked my traveling companion, Professor Mai, formerly a professor of French, Vietnamese, and Chinese literature, and now chairman of the Association of Arts and Letters, to point out the town center when we reached it. The former marketplace is a flattened field of rubble in a bend of the river. A few of the buildings of brick and stone are still standing, but the rest of the town was wiped out. Much of the population has now returned, and wooden dwellings are scattered among the ruins. The same is true of the village of Phan Xuyen, not far away. Than Ho itself is a rich agricultural province. Rice fields, a pattern of many shades of green, stretch far into the distance along the road, which also winds through foothills and the fringes of heavy jungle where tigers are said to roam. The vegetation, wild or cultivated, is lush and luxuriant. Watching the peasants working in the fields, the young boys leading their water buffalo, one almost forgets the war until a sharp reminder comes: a cratered field, the rubble of a village, a twisted wreck of a railroad car. We stopped to eat lunch on a wooded hillside where a few peasant women were collecting pine needles. Our host warned us to look carefully if we walk far away from the road, since there are still unexploded bombs. The capital of Than Ho province, a city of 70,000, I was told, was heavily bombed. The details were related to Professor Mai, who was province chairman in 1947 to 1948 and had been a clandestine member of the Communist Party since its formation in 1930. We passed the wreckage of the provincial offices, now totally destroyed. One wall of the large hospital remained standing. A factory in Than Ho City was almost also demolished. Its separate shops are now dispersed in the surrounding countryside, hidden in the caves. A nearby power station was severely damaged, but I was told never ceased to function. In the city itself, there has been little reconstruction of the original buildings, but here Too much of the population had apparently returned, and there are wooden structures everywhere alongside the ruins and buildings that remain. Than Ho is near the sea, and we drove to an attractive beach. Not far offshore, we were told. Ships of the Seventh Fleet have been stationed, and there has been much naval shelling as well as aerial bombardment. Saboteurs and spies were landed in the area, but quickly caught, so we were informed. Wooden fishing boats line the beach. There used to be a resort area in the surrounding hills. It was demolished by the bombardment. Near Than Ho City, the Ham Rong Bridge spans the Ma River. The largest of the bridges were crossed. It is now a rickery structure of twisted steel and shattered concrete. Traffic inches across in a single lane. We were told the story of the bridge one evening in the dim and flickering light of the provincial offices, now hidden near a village some distance from Than Ho City and indistinguishable from other clusters of dwellings. Later, we were shown a film recording of the same events. The narrator was Miss Ham, 25 years old, the chief of the militia of Than Ho Township. 5 years ago, she was the militia chief of the village at the site of the Ham Rong Bridge. The bridge was attacked daily from early 1965 until the suspension of the bombing in this region in April 1968. The bridge and surrounding area were bombed with high explosive and aerial torpedoes and shelled from ships offshore. 99 jet planes were downed in these attacks. A steep hillside along the bridge was reduced to one-third its former size by the bombardment. The village nearby was destroyed, with many casualties. We returned to the bridge the next day, this time accompanied by the head of the local branch of the Vietnam Fatherland Front, essentially the successor organization to the Viet Minh. To me, he looked 30 at the most, but he obviously is considerably older since his 17-year-old son is a university student in Hanoi. He related the outlines of the story again as we stood at the bridge in the chilling wind of the monsoon. The hill beside the bridge, a flag planted on a summit, was indeed far smaller than in the films we had been shown on the evening before. Its rocky slope was torn and shredded. From where we stood to the hilly ridge in the distance, the fields were barren. There is no trace of the former village. The area has been bombed so heavily that even the craters are not delineated, as they generally are along the road. Only the shell of the building that houses the power station remains in a battered plain. Carved in the hills beyond, just visible from where we stood, are the words, "Quiet Thang, determined to win," quote unquote. The bridge still stands, severely damaged, but proud and defiant, a symbol of deep significance to the people of Than Ho. This scene summarizes more than anything else the mood of the people I met, from the premier to students in the university, workers in the factory, and peasants in the villages. So far as I can tell, the country is unified, strong though poor, and determined to withstand the attack launched against Vietnam by the great superpower of the Western world. The Vietnamese see their history as an unending series of struggles of resistance against aggression by the Chinese, the Mongols, the Japanese, the French, and now the Americans. Over and over, this history was recounted to us. A dozen times we were told how the Chinese had been beaten back, how the Mongols, who conquered most of Asia and Europe, were unable to cross the Annam Mountains into Vietnam because of the fierce resistance of the Vietnamese peasants, unified even in feudal times, in opposition to the aggressor. As the director of the Historical Museum led us through exhibits, beginning with the Stone Age, the members of our entourage listened with obvious fascination to his accounts of the ancient culture and the details of each battle, each campaign. In the military museum, the same was true. Those who were with us had surely been through this innumerable times, but one could hardly guess it as they listened with rapt attention to each familiar detail. The Vietnamese see their history as a series of victories, each after a long struggle. A less optimistic view of the same events is that there have been periods of independence in a history of occupation by outside powers. It is striking that they do not interpret their past in this way. I am sure that I had suggested any such interpretation, I would have struck them as bizarre and perverse. There is also no mistaking the confidence with which they approach the future. We spent an afternoon discussing the present situation with the head of the special representation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. There we met several war victims from the South, hideously maimed in Hanoi for extended medical treatment. The PRG representatives in Hanoi expect a long and bitter war in the South. They expect the United States to leave an army of 200,000 to 250,000 men while providing distinction and logistic support for a puppet army of about 800,000 and continuing or even extending the technological war. They calculate that under President Johnson, about 2 million tons of bombs were dropped in South Vietnam, while the Nixon administration had already reached the level of 1.2 million tons while intensifying the chemical war. The aim of pacification, quote unquote, they see as concentration of the population in areas that can, it is hoped, be controlled by armed force, areas surrounded by a no man's land of devastation and destruction. They believe that this policy cannot succeed and there will be internal decay within the region, administered by the increasingly authoritarian and repressive Saigon authorities. They look forward to a coalition government that will organize free general elections and elect a national assembly, and specifically mention such people as Duong Van Minh and Tran Van Don as representatives of a possible third force with which, if I understood correctly, they feel could cooperate. But they say no present sign that the United States would be willing to permit a representative coalition government in South Vietnam. I believe that the leadership of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam also expect a long continuing war and see no indication that the United States intends to abandon its efforts to subjugate South Vietnam and to dominate the Indochinese peninsula. They do not see any sign of American seriousness in Paris and interpret each American proposal, quite correctly, I believe, as one or another scheme to maintain the American puppet regime in power in South Vietnam. They expect that the bombing of the North may be resumed as the American position erodes elsewhere in Indochina. They anticipate with confidence that the American position will deteriorate. Because of the likelihood of resumption of the air war, cities are not being reconstructed and factories remain dispersed. Although North Vietnam has considerable potential for development of hydroelectric power, no dams are being built. Quite apart from the toll taken by the war itself, the threat of further war is a great barrier to development and industrialization. We spoke one evening to Hong Tung, the director of Nhan Dan, the major newspaper of North Vietnam, and a member of the Central Committee of the Lao Dang Workers' Party since 1950. In the 1930s, he took part in the youth movement and was jailed from 1940 until 1945 when the Japanese overthrew the French colonial government. He was in charge of the Hanoi section of the victorious insurrection in August 1945, and then took part in the First Indochina War against the French, fighting in the Red River Delta region. He too outlined to us the course of Vietnamese history and described the present political and social organization and the plans for development. He spoke softly with great feeling about these long struggles, about the suffering of the people, and about the problems that still face them in the future. The aggressors, he said, have forced the whole of the population to fight or accept death. Our country and the other Indochinese countries have experienced all kinds of policies and war methods. Our countries have been testing ground for the French, the Japanese, and now the Americans. We think that in the whole of history, there has not been a people that has to undergo as many kinds of wars. Take only the United States. They have tried strategic Hamlets, a special war of Kennedy, the local war of Johnson, and the special local war of Nixon. We have had to deal with all kinds of theories and doctrines. Our people have not been destroyed. In fact, the United States imperialists have put into use all the forces they can gather. Take the strategic hamlets. This was a great effort. They destroyed tens of thousands of villages and carried away millions of people. Then they brought in 500,000 troops. They undertook the air war against the North. We cannot find in history such a concentration of bombardment. In South Vietnam alone, 3 million tons of bombs, and in addition, other kinds of ordnance. It far exceeds World War II. The Vietnamese are a small people, only 37 million. Now we have reached this stage. We can go to the end. In 1954, he added, "We were not vigilant enough, and we did not expect another war. But now," he said, "it is understood that the United States ruling forces do not wish to leave Asia to its own people. Nixon may succeed in gathering the reactionary forces of Asia, but the forces opposing imperialism will also gather together. There will be a long struggle, the reactionary forces against the popular forces in Asia, but the feeling of nationalism runs very high, and the reactionary forces cannot win." Premier Van Dong spoke in a similar vein. President Nixon, he said, seems to want to expand the war. Cambodia is an example. But this sorcerer is not always in a position to control what he has created. Prince Sihanouk has called for armed struggle, and the three peoples of Indochina will now combine their patriotic struggles. In the end, justice is the decisive factor, and justice will prevail. We asked whether he conceived of some kind of federation of the peoples of Indochina in the long run, and mentioned Senator Fulbright's recent statement that North Vietnam, as the strongest and most dynamic society, would be likely to dominate the region. The premier agreed that North Vietnam is stronger than its neighbors in Indochina, but forcefully dismissed any possibility of dominating the region and rejected any thought of federation in the foreseeable future. Even for the reunification of Vietnam, he said, it is impossible now to provide a specific plan, a quote-unquote blueprint. The Indochinese peninsula must be free and independent. South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos will be neutral. Given the present situation, this is a likely prospect. Only Nixon is opposed to this. It is interesting that Pham Van Dong reiterated the formula proposed by the National Liberation Front in 1962 and ignored, in fact, suppressed in the United States, namely that South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia be neutral. Then as now, this was a very reasonable proposal and a likely outcome if the United States were to withdraw from the region. Then as now, there are no prospects for achieving the neutralization of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia because the American insistence on retaining these countries within the American orbit, along with the periphery of the Asian land mass. The premier also expressed confidence in the future. B-52s and computers can't compete with a just cause and human intelligence, he said. The Vietnamese people and the other people of Indochina must still undergo great suffering, but ultimately they will win. It is, of course, not surprising that the leaders of the country should wish to appear confident before foreign visitors. However, I sense no deviation from this mood in discussions with others. The people I met exhibited no bravado, only quiet confidence in the justice of their cause and the eventual achievement of independence and the defeat of foreign American aggression. The personal stories they tell are sometimes painful beyond words. We had a few hours to spare on our last afternoon in Hanoi, and we were taken on a tour of the city. In Reunification Park, near a lake surrounded by newly planted trees that are characteristic of the southern part of Vietnam, my translator told me something of the story of his life. He is a native of the South, from Quang Ngai province. He had joined the Viet Minh as a young man, and then came north with his father in 1954, leaving his mother and sisters behind, and expecting to return in 1956 after the promised elections that were to reunify the country. Since that time, he has heard not a word from any member of his family in the South. The United States not only prevented the elections, but moved at once to block all communication, even mail, between North and South Vietnam. He can guess what his family and friends have suffered since. With some reluctance, I told him that I knew of the recent history of Quang Ngai province, more savagely attacked than any other part of Vietnam. Now that I have returned home, shall I send him Jonathan Schell's book on the American destruction of Quang Ngai province, or the reports of Dr. Alhi Nema, director of the Canadian Tuberculosis Hospital in Quang Ngai province, until August 1968, when he left because he felt he could do nothing useful there more, because he said, "My service was futile." Dr. Nema reports that he did nothing about the My Lai slayings, which he knew of at once. Quote, because nothing was new. It was nothing new. They were being talked about among the Vietnamese people, but no more than any other incidents. For example, the massacre of San Tra in February 1969, and another similar incident during the summer in Mo Duc district. I had heard this type of story many times before, however, and had spoken to U.S. and Canadian officials about the senseless killings of civilians that were going on, the senseless bombings. The province, he reports, had become a no man's land, with half the population in refugee camps, children starving, and much land and foliage destroyed. His patients were constantly telling him of the shootings of their family and friends, and every time he treated a child for war wounds, quote, 5 more were brought in. Claire Culhane, who worked in 1968 as an administrator in the Canadian TB hospital in Quang Ngai, said a report filed from the hospital in April 1968 mentioned the difficulties of working in an area with Americans, quote, who boasted about the brutalities and massacres they were engaged in. Shall I send him the books now appearing about the My Lai massacre, or about the incomparably greater atrocity of the war itself in Quang Ngai, or any other part of the country that resists American rule, question mark? Mr. Tree, my translator, knew about most of this and spoke of it with uncanny qualm. It is remarkable that one senses no hatred, no hostility towards Americans, but rather a great curiosity about American life, sympathy for the difficult situation of those in the peace movement who are forced to struggle against their government, quote unquote, even sympathy for the soldiers and pilots who are misled into participating in the, quote, sale guerre of the Americans in Vietnam. In Than Ho province, near the province capital, we visited a factory buried inside a mountain. Some 30 to 35 men and women worked there with machine tools, making parts for buses and trucks. Generally, there are 2 people at a machine, one a skilled worker, one an apprentice. Over tea and beer, in one corner of the dank and dimly lit cave, the manager told us how the entire factory had been dispersed during the air war of destruction, quote unquote, to such sites as this one. The mountain itself had been heavily bombed, but no damage had been caused to the facilities inside the cave that was hewed out by hand while the bombing proceeded. Afterward, the workers in the cave grouped themselves at the end of the table where we were sitting and, as a gesture of welcome, sang songs, patriotic and sentimental, and declaimed poems. The whole experience was intensely moving. As I left, I swore to myself not to speak or write about it, knowing how a sophisticated Westerner might react. Let the reader think what he may. The fact is that it was intensely moving to see the spirit of the people in this miserable place, working in the face of all the obstacles that American racist colonial power can erect to defend their country and to find their way into the modern age. We left the factory on an unpaved road through the heavily cratered fields and went on to a remote agricultural cooperative quite far from the main highway. Even more tea and beer. The mayor, a young woman who looked in her mid-20s, provided us with details about production and a village organization and answered some questions about their plans and hopes. 2/3 of the workers are involved in handicrafts, mostly weaving. They hope to receive machinery from the state of this industry, now partially collectivized. The fields are intensively cultivated, as we could see driving past. And like most villages, they have now achieved 2 harvests a year in their rice fields, more than doubling former production levels, while at the same time diversifying their crops considerably. The road to the village and the fields within sight are lined with young pine trees, planted to a recent reforestation campaign, and signs of which are visible everywhere. We spent several hours in the cooperative visiting a small dispensary and two schools. The dispensary, clean and moderately well equipped, had separate sections for Western and Oriental medicine. Outside the Oriental pharmacy were baskets of many different types of herbs, most of them from the garden of a dispensary. All children are now born in the maternity section of the dispensary. The wards were empty when we were there. A few patients were in the clinic, and in the maternity section, several women were chatting with a young mother whose newborn baby was in a crib in the next room. We were told that the traditional diseases, malaria, trachoma, are virtually non-existent. They intend to maintain traditional and Western medicine side by side, but I noticed that in the Oriental section, the practitioners and the pharmacists were considerably older. There is a larger district hospital for the more serious cases. I did not ask whether the large province hospital, destroyed during the air war, has been rebuilt somewhere else. We sat in a mathematics class, 7th grade, children of 14 for some time. There were 45 children studying geometry. I looked through some of the children's notebooks, which contained neatly done, quite advanced algebra problems. The lesson was lively. Children tried to work out proofs of theorems as the teacher sketched their proposals on the blackboard. The level was remarkable, easily as advanced as anything I know in the United States. It was particularly striking to find such work in a more remote village, barely a generation removed from illiteracy. We were told that literacy among adults has been nearly universal for some years, and that in this agricultural province of 2 million, everyone receives 10 grades of schooling, and about 800 students go to the university each year, about 200 of them abroad, most, perhaps all, I am not sure, to Eastern Europe. In principle, most are expected to return to the village. The war, however, has disrupted the intended normal pattern. Later, we were told that this village was of a medium level from an economic point of view, not among the poorest or the richest in the area, and I gather that our visit was intended as something of a gesture of encouragement for the villagers. The peasants have private gardens, and there is a free market alongside the state market, literally alongside, as we saw later in Hanoi while walking through the market area, where both are housed under one roof. On street corners in Hanoi, one still sees peasant women selling their produce. However, there seems to be little incentive for the peasants to use the free market, since agricultural prices set up by the state are, I understand, made artificially high in accordance with the policy of equalizing standards in the country and city. There are still some peasants who have not joined the cooperatives, but apparently not many, the advantages of joining being obvious, not only because of the state assistance, but also because of the benefits achieved through mutual aid. Along the road to the village, we saw groups working on irrigation projects, constructing large earthen dikes and channels, and the completed irrigation works from earlier projects can be seen everywhere. The larger irrigation projects are constructed by the state. Local projects are developed under regional organization and by the villages themselves. In principle, the cooperative is expected to put aside from 1 to 5% of its income from agricultural production and a varying percentage of its income from other production for development, presumably under independent village-based initiative. A general meeting of the cooperative makes decisions about such matters and sets the rate of accumulation in the program for development, deciding, for example, whether to build a school, to work for extra profits, and so on. An annual meeting of all adult members selects an administrative committee for the cooperative. We were told that in traditional Vietnamese peasant society, there was a certain degree of mutual aid and some communal land, and also considerable village and regional independence. Landholdings were limited in size by the law of the king. Under the French, this was changed. Free ownership of land was permitted, and large plantations were developed as well, particularly in the South. Catholics In the South, Catholics were particularly privileged, and many priests and archbishops became great landowners. Large feudal holdings grew, quote, when the stork can fly and never get tired. There was very little development, either industrial or agricultural. Now great efforts are being made, apparently with success, to expand the agricultural production and to develop regional industry that is related to local needs. The New Zealand geographer Keith Buchanan has discussed the early achievements of the Vietnamese Revolution in the context of a general review of problems of development in Asian peasant societies. He concludes, the achievements of the North Vietnamese in the economic field have been considerable, and they demonstrate to the rest of Southeast Asia the conditions under which real economic progress is possible. The achievements in the socio-cultural field, more specifically in the field of minority policy, have been equally striking, and these, in the long run, may prove of even greater relevance to the neighboring countries of Southeast Asia. Of course, he was writing before the bombing destroyed most of the early achievements of industrialization. The process of regional diversification was spurred by the air war and is now apparently to be maintained and extended. It is surely a very healthy development. The price may be higher and quality not always good, but goods are produced for local needs and self-supply in each province, we were told by Hong Tong in a discussion of these questions back in Hanoi. Special attention is given to training of skilled workers. Heavy industry will have to wait. As present plans are to develop agriculture and small industry related to agriculture and local needs. The country has rich supplies of metals, coal, and other material requirements for industrialization and can develop ample hydroelectric power when the threat of bombing is removed. With remarkably high standards of education and health extending to the remote areas as well as the urban centers, there seems every possibility that these goals can be realized and that North Vietnam can be spared a Manila, a Bangkok, or a Saigon. An artificial consumer culture for a minority of the privileged in the midst of urban slums and rural stagnation. Although there appears to be a high level of democratic participation at the village and regional levels and some degree of leeway, limited to be sure by the exigencies of war. For independent planning at these levels, still major planning is highly centralized in the hands of the state authorities. As Hong Tong explained, the Central Committee of the Laotian Party sets the general lines of policy. These plans are implemented by government bodies selected by the National Assembly, which also drafts specific plans. The ministries are responsible to the Assembly, which is chosen by direct election from local districts that extend over the entire country, including the mountain tribesmen, who are well represented. The managers of local enterprises are selected by the government ministries in charge of various branches of the economy. Each factory has a congress once a year of all workers, to which the manager reports. A party cell in the factory containing 10 to 20% of the workforce gives advice to the manager. There is also a trade union organization which seems to concern itself largely with education and welfare programs. There are also in each workshop production teams of skilled and unskilled workers, and apparently there are plans, in details of which I have no time to investigate, to rearrange the internal organization of the enterprises. The account is based on information provided in conversations with officials at various levels of administration and other knowledgeable people whom I met. Evidently, I am in no position to flesh out the account with detailed impressions or the results of personal investigation. The central planning role of the Lao Dong Party is stressed in the major government documents. Li Duan, in his recent analysis of the great problems, essential tasks, and principles and methods of action of the Vietnamese Revolution, lays great stress on this governing role. An important task of the economic organization is to determine correctly the relationships between the party, the state, and the popular masses in the matter of economic management. As director and general staff of the Army of Builders of the Economy, the party has the mission of defining the line and fundamental measures, fixing the leading principles, the programs and methods, mobilizing the masses for a powerful offensive on the economic front, supervising the activity of the governmental sources. Party direction is a historical necessity which guarantees for our economy a development conforming to a fixed orientation, safeguards the right and interest of various strata of the population, and reinforces incessantly the governing role of the people. In the revolution in general and economic development in particular, our party has no interest particular to itself. The totality of this national economy, just like each factory and each rice field, is the property of the people under different forms and in varied economic and technical conditions. The objective reality requires the party to arrange for different modes of direction that fit each case: industry, agriculture, factories, cooperatives, and that permit the party to maintain its directing role, making sure that the managerial prerogatives of administration are respected and at the same time assuring the popular masses the direct exercise of their right to rule. Duan's policy statement reveals clearly the extent to which the Vietnamese revolution, in its current state at least, is a revolution of modernization and development. Quote, to tighten the belt, to reduce all non-essential expenditures, and to resolutely commit capital for accumulation is a dominant necessity and testifies to a high level of political understanding with respect to the construction of socialism. The revolution of development, Li Duan stresses, must be the work of the masses of the population and must involve direct participation in self-education. In the present state of Vietnamese society, management of the economy must be very flexible in conformity with the economic laws of socialism and of the process of development proceeding from small scale to heavy production. It must combine unifying central direction with the right of governance of the various branches, regions, and units of the base. It must extend the system of planning while making the use of market relations where appropriate for regulating economic indices and economic activities of secondary importance not provided for by the general plan, and extending the domain of general accounting. It must promote both the material interest and the political and ideologic education, the socialist education, and the great masses of the population. That all these tasks are compatible is not obvious, and it remains to be seen how they can be realized. The present plan appears to be a composite of Communist Party ideology, traditional Vietnamese socio-cultural patterns, the necessity of running a wartime economy, and the general problems of modernization and development. My personal guess is that, unhindered by imperialist colonial intervention, the Vietnamese would develop a modern industrial society with much popular participation in implementation and direct democracy at the lower levels of organization, a highly egalitarian society with excellent conditions of welfare and technical education, but with a degree of centralization of control, which in the long run will pose serious problems that can be overcome only by eliminating party direction in favor of direct popular control at all levels. At the moment, the leadership appears to be approaching these problems in a flexible and intelligent fashion, but the problems of creating a modern, egalitarian, democratic, industrial society are not slight. They have not been solved successfully anywhere in the world as yet, and it will be extremely interesting to see how they are faced in the future if the Vietnamese are given the opportunity to deal with their internal problems under the conditions of independence and peace that they are presently struggling to achieve. Richard Gott, a journalist with much experience in underdeveloped countries, summed up his impressions after his recent trip as follows. To anyone familiar with the underdeveloped rural areas of the world, especially in Latin America, North Vietnam is by no means an abjectly poor country. The population is poor, of course, but there is no quote-unquote misery, that appalling, hopeless poverty one encounters too often in the third world. Of course, there are inequalities. Hanoi is better off than the countryside. The delta areas are richer than the panhandle. The mountainous regions have less pressure of population and more access to wood. But by getting rid of the rich and avoiding extremes of poverty, Vietnam gives the impression of a prospering, cohesive society, unique in the underdeveloped world. He quotes an old man in a southern province. When a landlord passed in the road, the peasants used to fold their arms and bow. Not until we had the land reform could we get rid of the influence of the landlord. Not until we had the land reform could we get rid of the influence of the landlords. This was our greatest difficulty. Vietnamese peasants lived under feudal lords, and for thousands of years, they were psychologically subservient to landlords. Whenever they wanted to do anything, they felt they ought to get the landlord first. Basically, the peasants have a very conservative attitude and are very mean. They have to be educated. This was the biggest problem. As Gott notes, the land reform of 1954 took a fearful toll. It was, quote, a chaotic affair with thousands of people using the opportunity to pay off old scores, and thousands were killed in an eruption of violence and terror. It also laid the basis for a new society which has overcome starvation and rural misery and offers the peasants hope for the future. The most important change of all is the peasants themselves. It would be hard to find now a more purposeful or determined people. There is none of that awful cringing deference that you encounter among Latin American peasants who remain beaten into apathy by centuries of landlord American oppression. The departure of the landlords has lifted a yoke from the peasantry and liberated an almost unprecedentedly powerful force. The British China scholar Jack Gray recently summarized Mao's socioeconomic theory of development as stressing the need for, quote, inducing the villagers gradually through their own efforts toward an intermediate technology to mechanize out of their own resources and to operate the machines with their own hands in a milieu in which local industry, agricultural mechanization, agricultural diversification, and the education, both formal and informal, growing out of these activities mutually enrich each other. Similarly, the collectives will be run by peasant cadres for the peasants. My impressions from what I have seen and read are that North Vietnam is successfully applying these concepts of development. To understand just how remarkable is the achievement of development in North Vietnam, it is useful to return to some of the forecasts made by the most knowledgeable experts at the end of the First Indochina War. Bernard Fall, writing in 1954, regarded the situation of the North as almost hopeless. The southern part of the country is its iron lung, with its huge rice surplus and dollar-earning exports of rubber, pepper, coffee, and precious woods. It is obvious that deprived of the South, the Ho Chi Minh regime would face either starvation, as in 1946, when it was deprived of southern imports, or a type of non-integration into the Red Chinese economy that would be the equivalent of annexation. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was cut off from the South by American duplicity and force. It has been severely bombed and drawn into a ruinous war, but there is no starvation. Far from it, and it has not been integrated into the Chinese economy. Its achievements are indeed quite remarkable. One purpose of the American racist bombing of the North, in Gerard Chalin's characterization, was to demoralize ordinary citizens until, directly or indirectly, they pressurized the Hanoi government into suing for peace. Thus, the bombing aimed as undoing the hard, patient work of many years in a world whose basic problem is surely the backwardness and penury of two-thirds of the planet. The United States government, whatever excuses it may invoke, has systematically destroyed the economic infrastructure of one of the 3 or 4 underdeveloped, quote-unquote, countries which have seriously laid the foundation for their own industrialization. In the view of most countries, especially the newer ones, the American intervention in Vietnam is an attempt to stifle national independence and dignity. This assessment is, I believe, entirely correct. The attempt has failed dismally. There is no doubt that the spirit of national independence and dignity is high, and that the Vietnamese are proceeding to lay the basis for a modern society. I have some sense of their achievements in this regard from the discussions with Vietnamese scientists and intellectuals. After a long and very productive meeting, I was asked to lecture about current work in linguistics at the Polytechnic University and was able to do so for about 7 hours to a group of 70 or 80 linguists and mathematicians. Their work in this rather remote area of science and scholarship was at an international level. I lectured approximately as I would at Tokyo, Oxford, or the Sorbonne. They are not familiar with the most recent work because of the unavailability of recent materials, but they are, I believe, in a position to close the gap quickly if this problem is overcome, and to help them overcome it in all fields in one tiny effort that Americans might make in the hopeless task of compensating for the destruction of much of what the Vietnamese have created with remarkable enterprise, diligence, and courage. One of the members of the group has studied in East Berlin in one of the outstanding world centers of linguistics. Beyond what he could supply, they make good use of the meager resources available. Other scientists and intellectuals, too, were extremely eager to discuss current work and educational curricula and to hear about our colleagues whom they knew by reputation or had occasionally met at international conferences. So far as I could judge, the work in some branches of mathematics was also excellent, though here as well there was a general problem of access to recent work. The problem is not limited to technical and scientific areas. Thus, a professor of American literature approached me to speak about current writing. He had not seen an American novel for 15 years and wanted to know in particular what Norman Mailer had been doing lately. The students generally read English, but have little familiarity with the spoken language. We're not able to follow a technical lecture. The translators, though excellent in general discussion, had considerable difficulty as the material became more technical and complex. One tried for about an hour and then apologetically has to be relieved. A second translator also made a noble effort, but the problems were severe. When they floundered, an older man in the audience intervened and corrected mistakes or explained obscure points. It was obvious that he had followed everything very well and understood the material I was trying to present. Finally, he took over completely and translated for several hours without a break. I was introduced to him later. He was the Minister of Higher Education of North Vietnam. Ta Quang Bu, a mathematician of note, who had, in fact, sent me a reprint on mathematical linguistics several years ago that I could not read since it was in Vietnamese. But that astonished me by its familiarity in the midst of the air war with current technical material. I did not think to ask, but I assume that this is the same as Ta Quang Bu, who was a general during the First Indochina War. We only had a brief chance to talk afterward, to my great disappointment. I think there are few countries where the Minister of Higher Education could have taken over the task of translating in an advanced technical lecture of this sort, or would have been willing to do so. And I was also impressed by the easy familiarity of relations within the group, the quality of the debate and discussion as we proceeded. After my last lecture, I was presented with several gifts. One, a Vietnamese dictionary that the linguistics had compiled and printed while they were just dispersed and in the forests and mountains during the air war. With justifiable pride, they observed that this work had been done while the American government was attempting to, quote, drive them back to Stone Age. In fact, at the Polytechnic University, the Vietnamese are training scientists of whom any society could be proud. I was quite surprised to find myself lecturing on technical material in Hanoi and spending hours with colleagues in discussion of work in progress in the United States. This surprise is a result of my own failure to overcome regrettable stereotypes. The Vietnamese are devoting themselves not only to securing their independence in a bitter war, but also to creating a modern society with a high level of general culture. Given half a chance, they will succeed in this, I am sure. It was a great personal pleasure for me to have the opportunity to meet with Vietnamese colleagues, to explore our common interests, and to learn of their work and plans. In his will, President Ho Chi Minh wrote that though the war may last long and though new sacrifice will be necessary, still, quote, our rivers our mountains, our men will always remain. With nuclear weapons, the United States could destroy these hopes. But short of that, I doubt that it can overcome the resistance of the Vietnamese or impose client governments on the people of Indochina. I left Southeast Asia after this brief stay with two overriding general impressions. The first was of the resilience and strength of Vietnamese society. It is conceivable that the United States may be able to break the will of the popular movements in the surrounding countries, perhaps even destroy the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam by employing the vast resources of violence and terror at its command. If so, it will create a situation in which indeed North Vietnam will necessarily dominate Indochina, for no other viable society will remain. The American intervention, like imperialist colonial wars in general, has stirred up ethnic and class hatreds, set groups into conflict, and raised every conceivable antagonism to the level of a bloody conflict. The Vietnamese and the Thai, the two strongest and most dynamic societies in the region, are virtually at war. The Cambodian army has massacred Vietnamese. The Mio have been set against the Lao and other hill tribesmen. The Thai are driving the mountains tribesmen from their homes and fear the native Lao population. The Thai and Saigon elites are now laying plans to devour Cambodia. Chinese nationalist troops remain active in border areas. Khmer mercenaries fight the Viet Cong alongside Thai and South Koreans brought in by the Americans. Native elites dependent on the flow of American goods and war expenditures have been drawn into a brutal war against the peasantry. Not all of this is a direct consequence of the American war in Indochina, but there is no doubt that every potential conflict, every form of latent hostility has been exacerbated as a result of the American intervention, often by design and direct manipulation, even if the United States were to leave Indochina to its own people, and there is, for the moment, no sign of such an intention. This legacy of hatred will remain, embittering the lives of the people of Indochina and denying them the hope of creating a decent future. So that's the chapter, North Vietnam. An excellent chapter. It's only about 20 pages. So I'm going to just make a few comments here. So you can see, the bombing. We talked about, the resilience of the Vietnamese people. Just the same thing in Indochina. The people are just, resilient, very resourceful, very, unique in their perspectives, unique in their culture, and they're willing to, deal with American brutality and aggression. We saw the International Control Commission. The bombing, was destroying North Vietnam, but, for some reason they were, avoiding hitting Hanoi directly hard. We learned about all the bombs dropped, the different incidents. U.S. imperial war of aggression. This was a U.S. imperial war of aggression. It was associated with brutalization of the people. Group of mafia, American anti-Asian white gangsters, murderous, murderous gangsters of mafia origin of the United States Congress, the U.S. Congress, mafia, anti-Asian, gun-violent, murderous gangsters did their action in Indochina and North Vietnam, and it was just a terrible thing. They pitted all of the Asian people against each other. The anti-Asian hate of the U.S. Congress and its representatives, its quote-unquote mafia politicians, did all of these things against the poor Vietnamese people. They drew the Thai against the Vietnamese. They drew the Chinese nationalists against the Vietnamese. They drew the Cambodians to massacre the Vietnamese. All sorts of things were done by the U.S. mafia government of the United States. It is a group of white mafia genocidal butchers, mafia butchers of white racism. And that's what they did. They did all sorts of things against the people of Hanoi. So let's continue on war crimes. It'll be, another 15 pages. It was an excellent chapter. We are not judges. We are witnesses. Our task is to make mankind bear witness to these terrible crimes and to unite humanity on the side of justice in Vietnam. With these words, Bertrand Russell opened the second session of the International War Crimes Tribunal in November 1967. The American people were given no opportunity at that time to bear witness to the terrible crimes recorded by the proceedings of the tribunal. As Russell writes in his introduction to the first edition, it is in the nature of imperialism that citizens of the imperial power are always running among the last to know or care about circumstances of its colonies. The evidence brought before the tribunal was suppressed by the self-censorship of the mass media of the United States white capitalist frauds, and its proceedings, when they appeared in print, were barely reviewed. Russell wrote that it is in the United States that this book can have its most profound effect. He expressed his faith in the essential decency of the American people, his faith that the ordinary man will react in a civilized way when he is given the facts. We have yet to show that this faith is justified. Russell hoped to, quote, arouse consciousness in order to create mass resistance in the smug streets of Europe and the complacent cities of North America. By now, there are few who can honestly claim to be unaware of the character of the American war in Vietnam. There are few, for example, who can now claim ignorance of the, quote, the new orators and Lidices described in testimony to the tribunal by a West German physician who spent 6 years in Vietnam. But consciousness has yet to create mass resistance. The streets of Europe and the cities of North America remain smug and complacent, with the significant and honorable exception of the student youth. The record of the tribunal stands as an eloquent and dramatic appeal to renounce the crime of silence. The crime was compounded by the silence that greeted its detailed documentation and careful studies. However, although no honest effort was made to deal with the factual record made public in the proceedings of the tribunal, its work did receive some oblique response. The Pentagon was forced to admit that it was indeed using anti-personnel weapons in its attacks against North Vietnam, though it could not resist the final lie that the targets were radar stations and anti-aircraft batteries. The hypocritical claim that the American bombing policy was one of magnificent restraint, that its targets were, quote, steel and concrete, were finally exploded beyond repair. A State Department functionary who had become an object of general contempt for his unending deceit regarding Vietnam demeaned himself still further by informing journalists that he had no intention of, quote, playing games with a 94-year-old Briton, referring to one of the truly great men of the 20th century. Those who were prepared to go beyond the mass media for information could learn something about the work of the tribunal from such journals as Liberation, as could readers of the foreign press, in particular Le Monde. The tribunal proceedings, along with the documentary study In the Name of America, which appeared in the same year, and the honest and courageous work of many fine war correspondents, helped to crumble the defenses erected by the government with the partial collusion of the American media to keep the reality of the war from popular consciousness. Though not reported honestly, the tribunal was sharply criticized. Many of the criticisms are answered effectively, I believe, in part one of the proceedings. There are two criticisms which retain a certain validity, however. The participants, the quote-unquote jurors, and the witnesses were undoubtedly biased. They made no attempt, in fact, to conceal this bias, this profound hatred of murder and wanton destruction carried out by a foreign invader with unmatched technological resources. A second and less frivolous criticism that might be raised is that the indictment is, in a sense, superfluous and redundant. This is a matter that deserves more serious attention. The Pentagon will gladly supply, on request, such information as the quantity of ordnance expended in Indochina. From 1965 through 1969, this amounts to about 4.5 million tons by aerial bombardment. This is 9 times the tonnage of bombing in the entire Pacific theater in World War II, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over 70 tons of bombs for every square mile of Vietnam, north and south. About 500 pounds of bombs for every man, woman, and child in Vietnam. The total ordnance expended is more than doubled when ground and naval attacks are taken into account. With no further information than this, a person who has not lost his senses must realize that the war is an overwhelming atrocity. A few weeks before the tribunal began its second session, 49 volunteers of the International Voluntary Service wrote a letter to President Johnson describing the war as, quote, an overwhelming atrocity. 4 of the staff leaders resigned. These volunteers, who had worked for many years in Vietnam, were among the few Americans who had some human contact with the Vietnamese people. Their activities and the letters of protest indicate their belief, surprisingly uncritical, in the legitimacy of the American effort in Vietnam. In this letter, they refer to the free strike zones, the refugees, the spraying of herbicide on crops, the napalm, the deserted villages, the sterile valleys, the forests with the huge swaths cut out, and the long abandoned rice checks. They speak of the refugees, quote, forcibly resettled, landless, in isolated, desolate places which are turned into colonies of mendicants, of the Saigon slums, secure but ridden with disease and the compulsion towards crime, of, quote, refugees generated not by Viet Cong terrorism, but by a policy of the war, an American policy, quote unquote, a process described by cynical American scholars as, quote, urbanization or, quote, modernization. Experts in pacification, quote, peace researchers, to use the preferred term, assure us that the only sense in which we have demolished the society of Vietnam is the sense in which every modernizing country abandons reactionary traditionalism. The methods of, quote, urbanization by which we so advanced the modernization of Vietnam are described, for example, by Orville and Jonathan Schell. We both spent several weeks in Quang Ngai, some 6 months before the Song Mai incident. We flew daily with the FAC's forward air control. What we saw was a province utterly destroyed. In August 1967, during Operation Benton, the pacification camps became so full that the army units were ordered not to generate any more refugees, quote unquote. The army complied, but search and destroy operations continued. Only now peasants were not warned before an airstrike was called on their village. They were killed in their villages because there was no room for them in the swamped pacification camps. The usual warning by helicopter, loudspeaker, or airdrop leaflets were stopped. Every civilian on the ground was assumed to be an enemy by the pilots by nature of living in Quang Ngai, which was largely a free fire zone. Pilots, servicemen not unlike Calley and Mitchell, continued to carry out their orders. Village after village was destroyed from the air as a matter of de facto policy. Airstrikes on civilians became a matter of routine. It was under these circumstances of official acquiescence to destruction of the countryside and its people that the massacre of Song Mai occurred. Such atrocities were and are the logical consequences of a war directed against an enemy indistinguishable from the people. Elsewhere, Orville Schell quotes a Newsweek correspondent returning from Quang Ngai province. Having had the experience in Europe during World War II, he said what he had seen was much worse than what the Nazis had done to Europe. Schell adds, had he written about it in these terms, ? No. Vietnamese-speaking field workers of the American Friends Service Committee describe more recent stages of modernization as seen from the ground. In one such removal during Operations Bold Mariner in January 1969, 12,000 peasants from Barangan Peninsula were taken to a waterless camp near Quang Ngai, over whose guarded gate floated a banner saying, "We thank you for liberating us from communist terror." The people had been given an hour to get out before USS New Jersey began to shell their homes. After 8 weeks of imprisonment, they were ferried back to what was left of their villages. given a few sheets of corrugated metal, and told to fend for themselves. When asked what they would live on until the new crops could be raised, the Vietnamese camp commander said, "Maybe they can fish," quote unquote. Reports by Western observers are limited to areas more or less under American control. The most intensive attacks are therefore unreported in the West. We do, however, have Vietnamese reports which will perhaps be given somewhat greater credence than heretofore now that the incident of Song Mai, which they described with accuracy at the time, has finally been made public. To select one such report virtually at random, in Trang Bang on the evening of October 24th, 1969, 3 flights of B-52s made 3 sorties, killing 47 people, wounding many others, mostly children and old folks, completely leveling 450 houses and devastating 658 hectares of fields. On the night of October 25th, B-52s flew 9 attacks in Quang Tri and Quang Nam provinces, dumping more than 1,000 tons of bombs, killing 300 people, wounding 236 others, setting afire of 564 houses and damaging hundreds of hectares of fields and orchards. In Pleiku, a fertile region, many flights of B-52s came in on the morning of October 17 and released 700 tons of bombs, which wrought havoc in hundreds of hectares of fields and orchards. In the area of New Bui and the village of Ninh Than, Hiep Ninh of the Take Ninh Cao Dai persuasion, the U.S. puppets resorted to toxic chemicals to destroy the crops and kill civilians. American hovercraft dumped thousands of CS cans, while helicopters dropped hundreds of thousands of toxic bombs on the villages. Moreover, enemy guns and mortars fired more than 5,000 gas shells over 1,000 people, affecting 13 children under 13 killed, Nan Than and Hiep Ninh villages, and more than 100 hectares of crops completely destroyed. And on, without end it went. The facts are, of course, familiar in a general way to the highest authorities of the United States. The Undersecretary of the Air Force, Townsend Hoops, wrote a memorandum in March 1968 in which he pointed out that ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and U.S. forces in the towns and cities are now responding to mortar fire from nearby villages by the liberal use of artillery and airstrikes. This response is causing widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties among people who were considered only a few weeks ago to be secure elements of the GVN, South Vietnamese government constituency. To prevent the present mode of tempo of operations of SVN is already destroying cities, villages, and crops, and is creating civilian casualties at an increasing rate. Hoops described the savage American reaction to the conquest of many cities by the National Liberation Front and the Tet Offensive in January 1968. For example, in Saigon, where in an effort to dislodge the 1,000 soldiers who had taken the city, artillery and airstrikes were repeatedly used against densely populated areas of the city, causing heavy civilian casualties. Or in Hue, where the American reoccupation left, quote, a devastated and prostrate city. Quote, 80% of the buildings have been reduced to rubble, and in the smashed ruin lay 2,000 dead civilians. 3/4 of the city's people were rendered homeless, and looting was widespread, members of the ARVN being the worst offenders. Elsewhere, the story was much the same. Everywhere, the U.S. ARVN forces mounted counterattacks of great severity. In the Delta region below Saigon, half of the city of Mytho, with a population of 70,000, was destroyed by artillery and airstrikes in an effort to eject a strong VC force. In Ben Tra on February 7th, at least 1,000 civilians were killed and 1,500 wounded in an effort to dislodge 2,500 Viet Cong. According to Hoops, the combat photographer, David Douglas Duncan, whose war experience covers World War II, Korea, Algeria, and the French War in Vietnam, quote, was appalled by the U.S. ARVN method of freeing Hue. He quotes him as saying, The Americans pounded the citadel and surrounding city almost to dust with airstrikes, napalm runs, artillery and naval gunfire, and the direct cannon fire from tanks and recoilless rifles, a total effort to root out and kill every enemy soldier. The mind reels at the carnage, cost, and ruthlessness of it all. Hoops also reports that the North Vietnamese force of 1,000 that had taken Hue in a day, a sizable part, quote unquote, escaped. Compare the figures on casualties cited above. These events occurred too late to be considered by the tribunal. I need not elaborate on what has been revealed since. Some indications are given in earlier chapters. For far more, see the study by Edward Herman, cited in footnote 2. I have mentioned all of this in connection with the question raised earlier, whether it was necessary today to publicize the detailed reports of the tribunal being the book that we discussed before. That's the book Against the Crime of Silence that I showed you. The link is in my YouTube description. Is it not true that by now the monstrous character of the war has penetrated the American consciousness so fully that further documentation is superfluous? Unfortunately, the answer must be negative. To see why, consider again the case of Townsend Hoops, who is now a leading quote-unquote dove. A reviewer of his book in the New York Times described it as the most persuasive presentation of the case for American withdrawal from Vietnam. It is instructive to compare his position with that of the, quote, hawks on this one hand and that of the tribunal on the other. Such as a comparison shows how narrow is the gap between the hawks and the doves, and how far removed the dove-hawk position still remains from the consciousness that Russel hoped would be aroused by the factual record and historical and legal argument of the tribunal. I want to stress that Hoops is one of the most humane and enlightened voices to be heard within the mainstream of American opinion today, surely among those who have had any significant role in the formation and implementation of policy. For this reason, his views are important and deserve full consideration. Our early strategy, as Hoops describes it, was to kill as many Viet Cong as possible with artillery and airstrikes. As late as the fall of 1966, a certain aura of optimism surrounded this strategy. Some were ready to believe that, in its unprecedented mobility and massive firepower, American forces had discovered the military answer to an endless Asian manpower and Oriental indifference to death. For a few weeks, there hung in the expectant Washington air the exhilarating possibility that the most modern, mobile, professional American field force in the nation's history was going to lay to rest the time-honored superstition, the gnawing unease of military planners, that a major land war against Asian hordes is by definition a disastrous plunge into quicksand for any Western army. But this glorious hope was dashed. The endless manpower of Vietnam, the Asian hordes with their Oriental indifference to death, confounded our strategy, and our bombing of North Vietnam also availed us little, given the nature of the enemy. As Hoops explains, quoting a senior United States Army officer, quote, Caucasians cannot really imagine what ant labor can do. In short, our strategy was rational, but it presupposed civilized Western values. We believe the enemy can be forced to be quote unquote reasonable, i.e. to compromise or even capitulate, because we assume he wants to avoid pain, death, and material destruction. We assume that if these are inflicted on him with increasing severity, that at some point in the process, he will want to stop the suffering. Ours is a plausible strategy for those who are rich, who love life and fear pain, but happiness, wealth, and power are expectations that constitute a dimension far beyond the experience and probably beyond the emotional comprehension of the Asian poor. Hoops does not tell us how he knows that the Asian poor do not love life or fear pain, or that happiness is probably beyond their emotional comprehension. But he does go on to explain how, quote, ideologues in Asia make use of the characteristic of the Asian hordes. Their strategy is to convert, quote, Asia's capacity for endurance and suffering into an instrument for exploiting a basic vulnerability of the Christian West. They do this by inviting the West to carry its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide, quote unquote. The Asians thus, quote, defy us by readiness to struggle, suffer, and die on a scale that seems to us beyond the bounds of humanity. At that point, we hesitate, for remembering Hitler and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we realize anew that genocide is a terrible burden to bear. Thus, by their willingness to die, the Asian hordes, who do not love life, who fear no pain, and cannot conceive of happiness, exploit our basic weakness, our Christian values, which make us reluctant to bear the burden of genocide, the final conclusion of our strategic logic. Is it really possible to read these passages without being stunned by the crudity and callousness of the American state? James Thompson, East Asian specialist of the Department of State and the White House between 1961 and 1966, has written of an unprovable factor that relates to bureaucratic detachment, the ingredient of crypto-racism. I do not mean to imply any conscious contempt for Asian loss of life on the part of the Washington officials, but I do mean to imply that bureaucratic detachment may well be compounded by a traditional Western sense that there are so many Asians after all, that Asians have a fatalism about life and a disregard for its laws, that they are cruel and barbaric to their own people, and that they are very different from us, and all look alike, question mark. And I do mean to imply that the upshot of such subliminal views is a subliminal question whether Asians, and particularly Asian peasants, and most particularly Asian communists, are really people like you and me. To put the matter another way, would we have pursued quite such policies and quite such military tactics if the Vietnamese were white, question mark? Let us continue. Seeing that our strategy, though plausible, has failed, the Air Force staff worked out several alternative strategies, which they presented to the new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, in March 1968. The Air Staff preferred the following: an intensified bombing campaign in the north, including attacks on the dock area of Haiphong, on railroad equipment with the Chinese buffer zones, and on the dike system that controlled irrigation for NVM agriculture. But Hoops and Air Force Secretary Harold Brown demurred. Why? They felt, quote, there was little assurance such a campaign could either force NVN or the conference table or even significantly reduce its war effort. Furthermore, quote, it was a course embodying excessive risks of confrontation with Russia. If they had any other objections to intensified bombing of the dike system of North Vietnam, Hoops does not inform us of them. Hoops himself preferred rather the following tactics: a campaign designed to substitute tactical air power from a large portion of the search and destroy operations currently conducted by ground forces, thus permitting the ground troops to concentrate on a perimeter defense of the heavily populated areas. The analysis seemed to show that tactical air power could provide a potent, quote, left jab to keep the enemy in the south off balance, while the U.S. ARV and ground forces adopted a modified enclave strategy, featuring enough aggressive reconnaissance to identify and break up developing attacks, but designed primarily to protect the people of Vietnam, and by population control measures to force exposure of the Viet Cong political cadres. As we know from other sources, Viet Cong political cadres, thus exposed, were to be eliminated by Operation Phoenix, which in the year 1968 had claimed to have killed 18,393 persons. Dr. Gareth Porter, a graduate student in Southeast Asian Studies at Cornell, states that the Phoenix program is responsible for the death or capture of 35,000 people. The majority of those arrested, quote, are merely low-level propagandists, supply agents, and others who are part-time helpers in the NLF ranks. He concludes his article with the following paragraphs. What is most significant about the program is that provincial police officials are expected to meet specific quotas for eliminating enemy catters each month, although the official term for these quotas is goals. As in the anti-communist denunciation campaign and the strategic Hamlet program, these officials who fail to meet the goals lose favor with the government. Those who produce results are promoted. Thus, quotas are likely to be met by applying practices which are already routine for the police. The victims are the people of South Vietnam, who must suffer yet another intensification of the terror which they have come to associate with the American police. This totalitarian-oriented machinery of arbitrary arrest and political surveillance, which the United States helped shape with money and advice, will not be dismantled if the Nixon administration manages to keep the present military regime in power. The men who have been put in office through American intervention have been frank enough to say that the facade of liberal institutions is only for American consumption. Perhaps this police state will be one of America's legacies to the Vietnamese people. Len Ackland, a former IVS worker in South Vietnam and then a team leader and analyst in Vietnam for the Rand Corporation, comments on the Phoenix program. What this all means is that civilians are being murdered. People who serve the political party, the National Liberation Front, as tax collectors, clerks, postmen, etc. The policy would be analogous to the administration murdering dissidents in the Internal Revenue Service, the, quote, juvenile delinquents of the Moratorium Committee or the Democratic National Committee. Those who would counter it by pointing out that there is, more precisely was, a civil war in South Vietnam might remember that the Viet Minh did naively accept the terms of political struggle after Geneva until forced by the South Vietnamese government and the United States, quote, to use counterforce to survive, as the American government specialist Douglas Pikes puts it. Returning to Hoops in a letter of February 13th, 1968 to Clark Clifford, he explains his preferences in terms similar to those quoted above. We should, he urges, stop the militarily insignificant bombing of North Vietnam and undertake a less ambitious ground study in the South, trying merely to control the technical term is protect, quote unquote, the populated areas. This policy would give us a better chance to develop a definable geographical area of South Vietnamese political and economic stability, and by reducing the intensity of the war tempo, it could materially improve the prospect of our staying the course for an added number of grinding years without rending our own society. Compare these recommendations with the tactics now being followed by the Nixon administration. Secretary of Army Stanley Rezer, testifying before the House Appropriations Committee, refused to predict how long the war would last, but he sees time as running on our side. Therefore, if we can just buy some time in the U.S. by these periodic progressive withdrawals and the American people can just shore up their patience and determination, I think we can bring this to a successful conclusion. To this remark, General Westmoreland added, I have never made the prediction that this would be other than a long war. Thus, the present Secretary of the Army agrees with the Hoops letter of February 1968 that we may be able to stay the course for, quote, an added number of grinding years if the American people will consent, if this policy will not rend our own society. And with this judgment, finally, Mr. Hoops disagrees. Vietnam is not, of course, the only source of division in America today, but it is the most pervasive issue of our discord, the catalytic agent that stimulates and magnifies all other divisive issues. In particular, there can be no real truce between the generations, no end to the bitterness and alienation of even the large majority of our youth that is neither revolutionary nor irresponsible until Vietnam is terminated. This is the primary reason why he urges we must withdraw from Vietnam. I do not want to suggest that the spectrum of Hoops de Ressort exhausts the contemporary debate over Vietnam, but there is little doubt that it represents the range of views and assumptions expressed within the mainstream of quote-unquote responsible American opinion. With this observation, we can return to the tribunal. Its assumptions, of course, fall entirely outside this spectrum. It is unfortunate but undeniable that the central issue in the American debate over Vietnam in respectable circles has been the question, can we win at an acceptable cost? The doves and the hawks disagree. Hawks become doves as their assessment of the probabilities and cost shifts. And if the American conquest were to prove successful, they would no doubt resume their former militancy. The tribunal is concerned with very different questions. It does not ask whether the United States can win at an acceptable cost, but rather whether it should win, whether it should be involved at all in the internal affairs of the Vietnamese, whether it has any right to try to settle or even influence these internal matters by force. Inevitably, despite disclaimers, the Russel Tribunal will evoke memories of Nuremberg and Tokyo. With the revelation of Song Mai atrocities, the issues raised in the war crimes trials have become at least a matter of public concern. We can hardly suppress the memory of our initiative at Nuremberg and Tokyo, or the explicit insistence of the United States prosecutor Robert Jackson that the principles of Nuremberg are to be regarded as universal in their applicability. After the trials, he wrote, "If certain acts and violations of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. We are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us." It might be argued that the verdicts of Nuremberg and Tokyo were merely the judgment of victors who sought vengeance and retribution rather than justice. I think there is some merit in this accusation, but right or wrong, it does not affect the broader question of the legitimacy of the principles that were recognized in the Charter of the War Crimes Tribunal. Legal niceties aside, the citizen is justified in taking these principles as his guide. A classical liberal doctrine holds that, generally speaking, it is the drawn sword of the nation that checks the physical power of its rulers. It is the fundamental duty of the citizen to resist and restrain the violence of the state. Those who choose to disregard this responsibility can justly be accused of complicity in war crimes, which is itself designated as a, quote, crime under international law in the principles of the Charter of Nuremberg. This is, in essence, the challenge posed to us by the Russel Tribunal. Richard A. Falk has written about this matter in an important recent article. He points out that Song Mai stands out as a landmark atrocity in the history of warfare, and its occurrence is a moral challenge to the entire American society. Nevertheless, it would be misleading, quote, to isolate the awful happenings at Song Mai from the overall conduct of the war. Among the war policies that might, he argues, be found illegal are these: 1, the Phoenix program; 2, aerial and naval bombardment of undefended villages; 3, destruction of crops and forests; 4, search and destroy missions; 5, harassment and interdiction fire; 6, forcible removal of the civilian population; 7, reliance on a variety of weapons prohibited by treaty. That these policies have been followed on a massive scale is not in question. Falk argues that if found to be illegal, such policies should be discontinued forthwith, and those responsible for the policy and its execution should be prosecuted as war criminals by appropriate tribunals. He also notes how broad was the conception of criminal responsibility developed under American initiative in the war crimes trials. In Falk's paraphrase, the majority of judgment of the Tokyo Tribunal held as follows: a leader must take affirmative acts to prevent war crimes or dissociate himself from the government. If he fails to do one or the other, then he, by the very act of remaining in a government of a state guilty of war crimes, he becomes a war criminal. And Falk emphasizes the obligation of resistance for the citizen if the evidence is strong and the state is engaged in criminal acts. It is correct but irrelevant to stress the vast differences in the political process of America and the fascist states. It is correct but hardly relevant to point out that the United States has stopped short of carrying, quote, its strategic logic to the final conclusion, which is genocide, as stated by Hoops. Thus, one cannot compare American policy to that of Nazi Germany as of 1942. It would be more difficult to argue that American policy is not comparable to that of fascist Japan or of Germany prior to the final solution question, quotes. There may be those who are prepared to tolerate any policy less ghastly than crematoria and death camps and to reserve their horror for the particular forms of criminal insanity perfected by the Nazi technicians. Others will not lightly disregard comparison, which, though harsh, may be well accurate. Nazi Germany was sui generis, of that there is no doubt, but we should have the courage and honesty to face the question whether the principles applied to Nazi Germany and fascist Japan do not as well apply to the American war in Vietnam. Recall the objective of denazification as formulated by those who were responsible for this policy. General Lucius D. Clay in 1950 described the primary objective as follows: to safeguard the new German democracy from Nazi influence and to make it possible for anti-Nazi, non-Nazi, and outspoken democratic individuals to enter public life and replace the Nazi elements which had dominated all life in Germany from 1933 to 1945. He reports, this was perhaps the most extensive legal procedure the world had ever witnessed. In the U.S. zone alone, more than 13 million persons had been involved, of whom over 3 2/3 millions were found chargeable, and of these, some 800,000 persons were made subject to penalty for their party affiliations or actions. All of this was, of course, apart from the punishment of war criminals, many of whom were high-ranking Nazis. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery saw one of the most important objects of the Allied forces of Germany as, quote, to charge the heart and the way of life of the German people. Denazification involved a cultural and ideologic change to proceed side by side with economic reconstruction. We could certainly ask whether 3 2/3 million Germans in the United States zone were more guilty of complicity in war crimes than any Americans. And we can ask whether a cultural or ideologic change in the United States, at the very least, is not imperative if many others who fear neither pain nor death are to be spared the fate of Vietnam. Some of these questions arise in a revealing exchange between Townsend Hoops and two journalists who published an interview with him in the Village Voice, see footnote 27. Hoops insisted that war crimes tribunals would be the worst thing that could happen to this country. That would amount to McCarthyism. You're proposing a system of legal guilt for top elected officials. The traditional way to deal with these top officials is to throw the rascals out. In an article in which he comments on, quote, the curious piece of reporting of Judith Coburn and Jeffrey Cohen, Hoops further explains that, quote, a democratic and an entirely elective form of retribution has already been visited upon Lyndon Johnson, and that his closest collaborators may also be excluded from high office. Hoops does not say whether this form of, quote, retribution would also have been more appropriate in the case of Japanese and German war criminals, should the West then merely have guaranteed a democratic election in which they might have been deprived of office, question mark? He does, however, reject the suggestion that civilian officials be held accountable for such incidents as the Song Mai massacre and for the bombing of North Vietnam and for such policies as those enumerated by Falk as cited above. In fact, Coburn and Cowan report that the quote, in the friendliest possible terms, he accused our generation of wanting to impose a totalitarian system of morality which would lead us to, quote, universal anarchy. Coburn and Cowan in turn ask, if Toho can be sentenced to be executed by an American war crime tribunal for leading Japan into a war of aggression, should the only punishment for an American president be that he is voted out of office while his Secretary of Defense serves a secure term as president of the World Bank, question mark? This seems not unreasonable question. Certainly not unreasonable for those who take seriously the statement of Justice Jackson quoted earlier. Nor do Coburn and Cowan appear unreasonable when they add, quote, the anarchists who frighten us most are those who wield the big bombs, control the courts, and assume for themselves the power to declare all their enemies outlaws. Hoops strongly disagrees. It is these strange conclusions that make the Coburn-Cowan article such a, quote, curious piece of writing. To him, it is crystal clear that such views could not conceivably be held or expressed by anyone who was a young man during the Second World War, or who was engaged in the mortal struggle of its aftermath in Greece, in Germany, in Berlin, in Korea. Only sensitive, clever children could be moved to such harsh judgments, unshaped by historical perspective and untempered by any first-hand experience with the unruly forces at work in this near cyclonic century. Those who designed our Vietnam policy were, quote, struggling in good conscience to uphold the Constitution and to serve the broad national interest according to their lights. They were, quote, almost uniformly those considered when they took office to be among the ablest, the best, the most humane and liberal men that could be found for public trust. And no one doubted their honest, high-minded pursuit of the best interest of their country and the dread of the whole non-communist world as they perceived these interests. To be sure, they were deluded by the tensions of the Cold War years. The tragedy of Vietnam, as he sees it, is that these good men were unable to perceive that the triumph of the national revolution in Vietnam would be neither a triumph for Moscow and Peking, nor a disaster for the United States. Furthermore, their policies received wide public support. Set against these facts, the easy designation of individuals as deliberate or impure, quote-unquote, war criminals is shockingly glib, even if one allows for the inexperience of the young. Similarly, it would be absurd to even ask whether a war crimes tribunal, even in principle, should try Nixon and Kissinger as, quote-unquote, war criminals, even though they continue to buy some time in the U.S. so that the war can be brought to a successful conclusion, in the words of the present Secretary of the Army. One should, I believe, agree with Townsend Hoops that, quote, what the country needs is not retribution, but therapy in the form of deeper understanding of our problems and of each other. No one, to my knowledge, has urged that those responsible for the massacre of the people of Vietnam, their forced evacuation from their homes, and the destruction of their country be jailed or executed, or even that the denazification procedure of the sort instituted against 13 million Germans in the United States zone be applied to the American population. Let us, by all means, try rather to achieve a deeper understanding of our problems. Among these problems is the fact that one of the most liberal and enlightened commentators on contemporary affairs can assure us that Asian hordes care nothing for death, fear no pain, and cannot conceive of happiness, while as for us, it is our Christian values that impel us to stop short of a final solution. Among our problems is the fact that the same spokesman can sum up the kind of historical perspective that sees our intervention in Greece in the 1940s as, quote, a moral struggle against whom, or the fact that those who were quite possibly the most humane and liberal men that could be found for public trust could set out to annihilate the Vietnamese in the belief, whether honest or feigned, it hardly matters, that they were combating a communist monolith that included Moscow and Peking in 1965. One of our problems is the doctrine developed by Mr. Hoops, in accordance with which, to take his words literally, no policy carried out by best American leaders with wide public support could be criminal, could in principle demand any response other than, quote, to throw the rascals out. In fact, I'm going to read that sentence one more time. One of our problems is the doctrine developed by Mr. Hoops, in accordance with which, to take his words literally, no policy carried out by the best American leaders with wide public support could be criminal, could in principle demand any response other than, quote, to throw the rascals out. In fact, it is not a trifle naive or even glib of Mr. Hoops to suggest that we throw the rascals out, question mark. Did we vote the rascals in, question mark? No one who considers carefully the role of the executive in civil military decisions in the post-war world, or the role of economic private empires in determining national policy, either in their own protected domain or within the parliamentary system itself, or the kinds of choices presented by the two competing candidate producing organizations, can so easily speak of throwing the rascals out. It would require social revolution, leading to a redistribution of power throughout the industrial as well as the political system for a significant change to take place in the top decision-making positions in American society. For this reason alone, one must fully accept the judgment that, quote, what the country needs is not retribution, but therapy in the form of deeper understanding of our problems and appropriate action to remedy these problems, which, given our enormous power and the problems of life and death for a good part of the world, our problems of life and death for a good, given our enormous power, our problems of life and death for a good part of the world. These problems can be on the agenda for any thinking person. More immediate, however, is the problem of bringing about a withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam. There is no indication that any such policy is envisioned at present. Rather, it is clear that the United States government is hoping to stay the course until victory is achieved, adjusting tactics where necessary to buy some time at home. For this reason, the proceedings of the tribunal are a document of first importance. The spirit and convictions that underlie it must, as Russel hoped, become part of the consciousness of all Americans. Richard Falk concludes the article I quoted earlier. Given the perils and horrors of the contemporary world, it is time that individuals everywhere called their government to account for indulging or ignoring the daily evidence of barbarism. The obsolete pretensions of sovereign prerogative and military necessity had better be challenged soon if life on earth is to survive. The tribunal takes one step, small perhaps but significant. The tribunal, or another like it, should turn to Czechoslovakia, to Greece, to a dozen other countries that are suffering in the grip of the imperialist power of the local forces that they support and maintain. Still more important, the work initiated by the tribunal should be carried further by groups of citizens who take upon themselves the duty of discovering and making public the daily evidences of barbarism, and still the more severe duty of challenging the powers, state or private, that are responsible for violence and oppression, looking forward to the day when an international movement for freedom and social justice will end their rule. So that's it. That's the whole book, At War with Asia by Noam Chomsky. The last chapter was war crimes on war crimes. And he does make reference, as you can see from the last chapter, to the proceedings of the tribunal against the crime of silence. This is the Russel Tribunal against the crime of silence, proceedings of the International War Crimes Tribunal, in which the United States was reviewed for their war crimes against the Indochinese people in total. It is a great book and a great resources. Please download these books and read them. As I said, they are excellent. They are excellent books for the sake of understanding these conflicts. So we're going to just review the last chapter. So we can see the gun-violent, white racist, anti-Asian mafia, United States Congress committed, a genocide, a near genocide against the Vietnamese people and the Indochinese people. We reviewed their, propaganda, the propaganda as the Asians were invincible. They were people who did not feel pain. There were no statements made as to how these assessments were made. They did not feel pain. We read that, Asians have a fatalism about life and a disregard for its loss, that they are cruel and barbaric to their own people, and that they are very different from us and all look alike, ? And I do mean to imply that the upshot of such subliminal views is a subliminal question whether Asians, and particularly Asian peasants, and most particularly Asian communists, are really people like you and me. Basically, we continue to see that, where did these statements come from, he asked. Where did these statements about the Asian people that were, elucidated by James Thompson, which was the East Asian specialist at the Department of State in the White House in Johnson administration, had stated. These are statements of racism. These are white, racist, mafia, gun-violent American gangsters. That is what they are. They are gun-violent American mafia gangsters that made these statements against the Asian peoples. We also talked about the war crimes. the systematic bombing, forced evacuation. We sent the Phoenix program. It was a murder program by the U.S. government, a murder program of any of the South Vietnamese peasants. Basically, peasants were roped into this program, were grabbed off the streets, were grabbed and imprisoned, tortured and murdered. And that was the summary of the program. The typical American racist, colonial, fascist, murderous dictatorship, the racist mafia American government, white frauds and liars and butchers of the U.S. government, the gun-violent white mafia state of the U.S. government. In addition to that, Falk, Nazi Germany. So we did a good section on Nazi Germany. So the bottom line is the U.S. government prosecuted war criminals in Nazi Germany and Japanese war criminals for their war crimes. Dr. Chomsky is comparing the U.S. government war in Vietnam to way surpassing Nazi brutality. The U.S. government, Nazi and mafia butchers, the mafia and Nazi thugs and gangsters of the U.S. government did way more, atrocities against the people of Vietnam. They did, just genocide. It was basically a genocide. They used phosphor bombs, cluster munitions, saturation bombing, all through Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And now, the U.S. became judge and justice in the War Crimes Tribunal. The American mafia, white mafia, murderous gangsters, became judge and justice in the War Crimes Tribunal. And what did that show? It showed nothing. They did nothing. They didn't apologize for this war. They, went out and murdered Asians in cold blood. They are anti-Asian, white, gun-violent gangsters, gun-violent mafia gangsters of the U.S. government that did Asian slaughter over and over again, open slaughter of the Asian people. We also talked about the fraudulent media, the white fraud media, and the white fraud capitalists who encouraged this war, encouraged its brutality, its open slaughter against the people of Asia. It was, just an absolute war criminal war by the U.S. government. They, they committed more atrocities than the Nazis did, more atrocities than the fascists of Japan did in any of their wars in World War II. America is number one in terms of Asian slaughter. Again, as we said, they are gun-violent, white racist, anti-Asian mafia, United States Congress, and that is what we end with. So I recommend, again, you download this book from my website. It is available, and please listen to the video. It is a great discussion of the At War with Asia, the United States government war with the Asian people, and it is, available on the YouTube description section. I'm sorry, I keep saying website. It's the YouTube description section. Please download it from the YouTube description section, both At War with Asia and Against the Crime of Silence. So let's get started. Let's finish up, and we'll be done. And then tomorrow will be United States penetration of Brazil. I'm going to start the book United States Penetration of Brazil. So please show up for that. Racist American government, murderous white gangsters, involvement in North Vietnam. We discussed Chapter 4, North Vietnam in At War with Asia. The American throat-slitting Congress of white racist mafia, quote-unquote, politicians conducted a vicious campaign in Indochina against the native Asian peoples. The summary is best put forth by Phoumi Vonvichit, pathet Lao leadership, who spoke with great bitterness about the effects of the American involvement on life in Vientiane. Mr. Vongvichit, referring to the depraved American culture, which included widespread prostitution, gambling, opium, and drugs, and cheating for the Laotian indigenous people, while the whites were given houses, economic success, jobs, and swimming pools. As usual, the American racist congressional mafia, gun-violent gangsters furthered fascist colonial oppression rather than democracy, as was being put forth by the pathet Lao. They flood Laos with counterpart aid policy, with surplus goods and introduction of the American depraved culture to turn Vientiane controlled areas into a military fascist U.S.-type new colony. This is typical of the sadistic third world murder, rape, and torture capital of the world, Washington in the United States, which at the expense of the native third world peoples uses machine gun dictatorship fascist violence to ensure American capitalist success while peddling lies in the media and Western press about its good intentions in liberating the people. Similar to Hitler's good intention in liberating Europe from the Jews, the American Congress, Johnson and Nixon, had good intentions of liberating the Indochinese through murder, torture, enslavement, drugs, opium, cheating and gambling, and machine gun violence against the people. Turning on to North Vietnam, we see a nation that is intent on helping its people through social upliftment, democratic scholarship and reading, book and university promotion, oil nationalization, rubber and textile nationalization, and farming of rice and other agribusiness. This contrasts sharply with the military fascist dictatorship of South Vietnam, run by the U.S. machine gun violent, murderous white mafia of U.S. Congress, who promoted prostitution, opium and drugs, gambling, cheating, murder, torture, enslavement, arbitrary imprisonment, university and library destruction, and destruction of democracy for the people of South Vietnam. So the United States racist mafia of Congress compares the two societies and peddles lies in the New York Times and Washington Post about, quote unquote, liberating the Vietnamese from the communists. Similar to Hitler liberating the Polish from the Jews, the U.S. was liberating the Vietnamese through murder, torture, enslavement, prostitution, drugs and opium, napalm, white phosphorus, and other vomiting gases, as well as direct bombing. This is Washington's contribution to Indochinese history, an abysmal failure of the mafia, American white frauds, and anti-Asian, gun-violent, murderous gangsters who committed, the U.S. Congress with its presidents, committed a genocide in Indochina. Again, they failed to pay reparations, to apologize for their mass murder and enslavement, destruction of the economy, and gang rape of the third world lands for capitalist oil exploitation. So it resembles their fascist American white, gun-violent, murderous mafia, anti-Asian gangsters of the U.S. Congress and its presidents all over Asia, including China, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Japan, and Singapore. So that's it. I'm done. The book is done. 2 hours and in perfect 2 hours. Please come tomorrow for United States penetration in Brazil. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.